Alex. I'll just go chronological. So I have an early career background in quantum physics, quantum computing. So that was at the University of Sydney in Australia in the early 2010s. In around 2014, I decided to move to Europe, spent about 5 or 6 years in business and startups, and actually just forgot about my technical roots for a little while. But in 2019, I just became kind of infatuated even with machine learning. I was just amazed by this new thing. It'd been around for some years, but I'd only started looking into it around then, and I decided to quit my job, learn about computer vision, and start consulting and freelancing and doing projects for various companies in that domain. Around 2021 to 2023 is when I got my first exposure to robotics. So I headed up the perception stack for a robotics startup in the US. And then 23, 24-ish, I joined Hugging Face and helped build their Le Robot library, which is their end-to-end machine learning for robotics library. Now I'm in, or as of the beginning of 2025, I'm in collaborative robotics. So I'm living in Seattle in the US. And this company, they do wheel-based robots that tote carts around in industrial settings. And I'm part of the bimanual manipulation AI research team. And so we keep ahead of the curve or on the curve, on the wavefront of state-of-the-art research and manipulation. And what we want to do is just make sure when that technology is ready, because we already have the fleets of robots out there with our customers, we can just bring it to the customers. We can hopefully be first to customer with that technology. Okay, so this talk is going to be, it's titled Smooth as Butter Robot Policies, which is like the title of a blog post I put out. But actually, we're only really going to get to that towards the end, because I just want to kind of take you through a journey. And maybe some of you aren't as familiar with machine learning for robotics, so I'll just give you an intro to that too. Explain to you, the works that I looked through to build on top of with this Smooth as Butter Robot Policies work. Okay, so getting started then. So end-to-end deep learning for robotic manipulation. What am I talking about? So I've got a pretty crude diagram down the bottom here of a robot arm. You can have 2 robot arms or more. You can have, other robot parts, not just a robot arm. You have sensors. So in each of these joints here, there are sensors that sense what the angle of the joint is. And then there are these cameras here pointing at the scene. And then there's an object to manipulate, right? And in end-to-end learning, the idea is you just go straight from these observations, these sensory streams, to robot action. So what do I mean by, and that's mediated by a neural network which you train. So by observations, I mean, these joint angles, potentially the pose, the 6th degree of freedom pose of the end effector, which you can compute from the joint angles, the camera images. I've got here, with a little asterisk, language command. So I've included that in the same list as observations, just because architecturally, normally that language command is treated just like any other observation. So the language command could be pick up the Lego block. And potentially other observation streams, but less frequently these bottom ones here. And then the action, what I mean by that is we're going to output joint angles or end effector poses. And they're all going to be relative to the current pose, right? Because typically you'll have something like 50 Hertz control loop. So that's 20 milliseconds per action. And so the action will be like a small difference from what the current joint angles are, right? And then you stack a lot of those together and you get smooth movement. So the naive approach here would learn this using like a mean square error objective, just like a regression objective. And so the model would put a single action at a time, and you'd have to run it at 50 Hertz. Just to give you an idea of what the data set looks like for this. So here's a video of me collecting a data set. I'm holding 2 kind of passive arms. They're called the leader arms. And as I move them around, the joint angles are read off from them, and they're then passed on to the leader arm, to the follower arms in the foreground, which actually do the work. Throughout the whole, recording, these camera streams are being picked up, and the angles on the robots are being picked up. So these are the angles in the follower robots, and also the angles that I'm transmitting from the leaders to the followers. So what you end up getting is a data set with a bunch of observation action tuples, right? And so your neural network is learning how to ingest an observation and turn that into an action at each time step. I see someone's got their hand raised there. Do we want to do maybe questions at the end, or?
Yeah, we can wait for questions at the end.
Okay, so that's how you gather one of these data sets. I'm just going to switch threads for a moment. We'll join these threads back together in a moment. I want to talk about diffusion models and flow matching. And hopefully you all know something about this, but I'm just going to try to align our language and mental models. So ostensibly, or like on the outside, what diffusion models look like without going too much into the details is you have the idea of a data domain, and we're probably all familiar with natural image generation. So I'll work with natural images for a moment. So you have the domain of all natural images. And what you do is you have a noising process, right? We have this scalar knob, which is like how noisy you want things to be. And you can like progressively noise like a data point here being a picture of a dog towards pure Gaussian noise. What you're learning to model, or you're learning an algorithm and a model which facilitates this algorithm, is to take such a noisy sample and that scalar value, the knob of how noisy it is, which I'm going to call the noise time step, right? That model is going to give you something which you can then use to make a step in the reverse direction from noise to clean data manifold, right? And if you have a model that does this well, what you should end up getting if you do multiple denoising steps is you should end up with like a clean sample. And it should look like plausibly from your data distribution, but this is not a real dog, right? Something else I want to say is like there's many different ways to think about or construct the math behind diffusion models and flow matching. I just want to focus on one that's my favorite mental model and will just help us going forward, and that's noise condition score matching. So you can imagine like, okay, so I'm going to introduce this concept called the data domain, which is like the domain of all possible pixel configurations in an image. And like the vast majority of those will just be noise, and then some of them will be natural images. And I've just tried to collapse that data domain onto a 1D axis here. And what I'm showing on the vertical axis is the probability density. So these are actually very thin Gaussians around actual natural images in your data distribution. And your model, really, in essence, what it needs to learn is an arrow. Like if you pick a random X on this data domain, which is just going to be noise, you want to learn an arrow that pushes you towards the modes of the actual data distribution. And you can't do that here because there's no gradient, there's no support where X is. So what you're going to do is you're going to apply a Gaussian convolution over the whole data domain, a really wide one, such that you get support everywhere in the data domain, right? And your image is turned into noise at this point. And what you then have, or hopefully can learn, is a model that learns the gradient of this curve here, or the gradient of the logarithm of that curve, right? And that is called the score function, right? And if you can learn that, then you can follow that gradient. And then at this point, you're at a lower noise step because you've moved towards the data domain. And your model is supposed to be able to learn how to do denoising at each kind of level of noise. So you can continue to follow this gradient as you sharpen these distributions and get onto the data domain. So that's my way of thinking about it, or many people's way of thinking about it, really. And all variants, like if you know about diffusion models, but not so much about flow matching, or the other way around, don't fret, because they all boil down to the same kind of basic concept. It's just based on the noise level, based on the noisy sample. Can you point towards the modes of the noise data distribution? Can you know what this score function is, or some variant of the score function? And there's a really great blog post if you want to have a look, two sides of the same coin, which kind of should builds a framework and a formalism where you can make all of these like variations of diffusion models equivalent, right? Okay, so now let's take the two threads that I was talking about and put them back together. And what we have then is diffusion, not diffusion models, but diffusion policy, right? And I cite this paper down here, diffusion policy in 2022. That and another paper around that time, caused like an explosion in interest in the field of end-to-end learning for robotics because it worked so well, right? So This, if you know about diffusion models, is just the standard algorithm that you do for denoising, right? So the algorithm goes like this, and part of that algorithm is a neural network. Is you take in an observation, you take in pure noise, and then you do multiple runs for this neural network, and you have like the output of the neural network is treated in such a way such that you can make a step in the denoising direction. And once you've done enough of these steps, you have a clean action chunk. Now, I haven't introduced what an action chunk is yet. So before I was talking about predicting one action at a time. Now let's just say we're going to predict 50 actions at a time in a row, say. So like if you have a control loop of 50 hertz, this means you need to run through this algorithm once. You get a chunk that is 50 steps long in time, and that runs for 1 second. And it's nice to draw it like this. So this is the dimension of like, okay, so this is the first joint, second joint, third joint. Don't know if you can see where my mouse is. Can you guys see where my mouse is? Yeah, okay. And then so it kind of looks like an image. It looks like a grid, which means that if you're familiar with diffusion modeling for natural images, you can kind of use those mental models here. Okay, so why do we want to apply diffusion modeling to robot policies? There are a bunch of really good reasons for that. So I tried to depict a few of them here. On the very left, I'm depicting multimodality. So if you do the naive approach, okay, so first of all, the setup is I've got a robot, and I want the robot to be able to eat cake, right? And as I showed you in a previous slide, I can collect demonstrations of that. So I collected many demonstrations of the robot eating one of these cakes, and about half of the time when I demonstrate, I go left, and half the time I go right? And when you do the naive approach of doing just like MSE regression on individual actions, what you get is you get a model which learns to average between the two modes. And that's these red lines here. So you're doing single steps and you're averaging between the two modes. And what happens is you don't get any cake at all. You just go halfway between the two cakes. Whereas with multimodality, which is what diffusion modeling does, you can actually represent the modes with the green and the blue arrows. The other thing is temporal consistency. So this is okay. So like let's say that even in the case that you do have multimodality for the single step model, right, where you're doing single actions at a time, what you're still going to get is because subsequent inferences on the model are independent of the previous ones. You're going to get, okay, the robot finds itself here. It says, okay, I'm going to take a step towards the cupcake. And then it says, okay, I'm going to take a step towards the cupcake. And then all of a sudden it says, I'm going to take a step towards the strawberry cake, right? Because it has no notion of what it did previously. It just has the current observation. And then I'm going to take another step towards the strawberry cake. And actually, no, cupcake. Okay, now that it's less ambiguous, it's just going to start moving towards the strawberry cake. But you get this hesitation here. Whereas at least if you're doing chunks, like action chunks, you have to model the data distribution. So as long as the human wasn't demonstrating with hesitation, you're going to be quite like, you're going to commit to a certain path with action chunks. And finally, very related to that is robustness and compounding error. So, if you're doing single step actions, with every step in either case, there's always a chance that you're going to fall a little bit off the happy path data manifold of the demonstrations. And then if you fall a little bit off, then the chance that you fall even further off is even higher. Error begets error, right? There's compounding error. So that's what I'm showing here with these red arrows, where they go off track and then they go further and further off track. And just do note that this is a lot worse in higher dimensions, right? And then with the green arrows, the same thing can happen, but you get to your objective in way less steps. So even if you have a little bit of error in the first step, there's less time for that error to accumulate by the time you've actually reached your objective. Okay, so those were the advantages of diffusion policy. What's one of the disadvantages? If any of you have used diffusion models in the past, you'll probably know that inference time can be quite slow. And I've been talking about a 50 hertz control loop, 20 milliseconds a step. But typically these sorts of models these days are 100 milliseconds inference, right? So what happens then? So what would happen in that case? You would generate a chunk, and then you'd roll that chunk out for a second. And then your robot would have to pause for 100 milliseconds, which is 5 control loop cycles, before the next chunk becomes available, right? So you'd have this kind of stutter step movement. And that wouldn't be good for a few reasons. One is that that sort of movement is out of distribution. That's not the sort of movement you had at demonstration time. Another thing is if the environment is dynamic, as in things change in the environment while your robot's frozen, that's not good either. And then finally, it's just not aesthetically pleasing. It doesn't look good. It doesn't look natural. So a naive approach, I'm going to call this a naive approach, is to do asynchronous inference. So what you're going to do, this is, I'm kind of trying to depict the first chunk of the horizontal axis is time here. You're going to generate that chunk and start to execute it. And you're going to get to a point where you know that you have enough runway to cover your inference delay of 100 milliseconds. And at this point, you're going to take the observation at that point in time and give it to the model and get the model to start working on the next chunk before you've run out of runway. And so you're going to continue moving along the same chunk, and hopefully then your new chunk becomes available and you switch to it just in time, right? Or maybe even before the end of the runway. So you discard the first part of your new chunk and you just start from like partway through the second chunk. Okay, but the naive approach still has problems, right? So here I'm showing you a scenario where there's this bimodal distribution in the training data. So there's this obstacle. You can go above the obstacle or below the obstacle. And then so let's generate this black chunk, and we start to move along the black chunk. And then at some point, we decide to start the next inference asynchronously, and we keep moving along the black chunk, right? And then the next red chunk becomes available, and we do a switch to it. But now we do this massive jump, which might not even be physically permissible on the robot, right? So you could just end up hitting the obstacle because of that. So that's not good. And some people have proposed doing temporal ensembles, so taking average of the black and the red curve. Obviously not in this context, because that's obviously a really bad idea. If you take the average, you end up running into the obstacle. So this context is probably a really good depiction of why temporal ensembling is a bad idea. And temporal ensembling is used, probably for other ends in mind, but generally it's just a bad idea because of this phenomenon. Okay, so what is it that we want then? Let's just frame what we actually want. Remember, prior to this, I said we have some algorithm which takes in noise in an observation and potentially a language command, right? And outputs an action chunk. What I actually want instead is, okay, so let's say this is the first action chunk, this blue chunk here, right? Time is still a horizontal axis. Let's say that at the beginning of this red box here is when I start the next inference. And this is I just continue to execute along the blue chunk while I'm getting the next chunk from the algorithm. I'd like to be able to give the algorithm, and what I'm going to call is this, what's inside this red box here, I'm going to call it the action prefix, right? I'd like to give that to the algorithm so it knows, hey, I need to make sure that whatever I produce next matches that. So here I've drawn that. So this is the green chunk, the next chunk here. It matches the blue chunk within that red box and continues on smoothly. So you're not going to have this issue of jumping between chunks. Okay, so how do we do that? And before moving on, because I'm going to mention these acronyms quite a lot, so I'll just introduce them. So there's a paper from Physical Intelligence that deals with this problem in a way that I really like, and what I'll be talking about next is they do some inference time conditioning. So they don't change the training procedure to include action prefixes, but they actually take a model as I've described so far, and because there's flexibility in the denoising process, they leverage that flexibility to be able to do this sort of conditioning at inference time. And that's the real-time execution of action chunking paper. That's RTC. I'll be calling it RTC. And they base a lot of their work, or most of the work in the paper, on the theories in pseudo-inverse guided diffusion models for inverse problems. I'll call that PyGDM, right? By the way, RTC works in a flow matching paradigm. PyGDM works in a noise conditioned score matching paradigm. And actually, RTC works in robot policies. PyGDM, in the results section, they talk about natural images, right? So a lot of the work in RTC was translating the theory there and making it specific to robots. Okay, so in order to explain all that, let's just get some groundwork out of the way. Let's just start to put things into more of a formalism and explain some notation. So we have this, I've mentioned this like scalar knob on how noisy things are. That's tau for us, and I'm going to call that flow time, right? And then we have the forward noising process, which is written as this, stochastic process here, right? This is a normal distribution, and when tau is equal to 1, and so before that, A is an action chunk, and the superscript is the action chunk at some level of noise tau, right? So when tau is equal to 1, this normal distribution has mean A1, so that's a clean data sample, and standard deviation 0, and that makes a lot of sense. And when tau is equal to 0, this has a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. So that's a standard normal distribution. That's pure noise, right? And then everything else in between is just like a linear interpolation on tau. There's a concept called the flow velocity. I mentioned the score function before. The flow velocity is a lot like the score function. Like, remember I said they all kind of predict the same thing, but there's like a scale. There's a different scale and there's a different offset, right? So flow velocity is like the score function. It's a vector that points, depending on like which paper you read, either from the noise to the standard to the clean data sample, or the other way around. But here it's going to be from the noise to the clean data sample. And then the denoising process is, suppose you have a model that is able to predict a V for you, a flow velocity for you. Then what you can do is you can take a noisy sample A tau and add to it a single step in that direction of V. And a step here is going to be a size 1 on n, because what we've done is we've taken the 0 to tau interval and we've divided it into n equal steps. And at inference time, you're free to choose that n. If you do like 100 steps, or you can do 10 steps, or you can do 5 steps. The more steps you do, the better your result is going to be, and that plateaus off at around 10, really, for like action generation. Yeah. Okay. So now that we have kind of like the notation down, let's go back to this problem that we said we had before, which is we want to kind of condition on this action prefix at inference time. And I apologize for the bad color coding here because I keep changing the color of these curves. But now in this diagram, the curve here, the gray one is my first action chunk, and the red one is the next one I want to generate based on that, right? I've drawn like the red in a solid line here where it overlaps because I have to generate the chunk that way there because it has to match the previous chunk. Whereas the dotted lines are just all variants of what you could have after that. They're all valid variants, because we only care about pinning down the chunk at the beginning. I'm going to introduce this W here, which you'll see later, which is like a mask. So it's 1s where we want the chunks to match and 0s elsewhere. Okay, so now on the right here, I've drawn, first blue blob is the data distribution. And then the second blue blob is the widened data distribution when you've added noise at some time tau, right? And then that's why it's larger as well. Now let's consider finding ourselves at some point in the denoising process where we have an A tau. At this point, without actually doing all the further denoising steps, we can ask ourselves the question: given the flow velocity that our model estimates here, based on this A tau, where might we end up in the data distribution, right? And I've depicted as this green blob here, right? And the green blob, it turns out by some of the math in PyGDM, is actually a normal distribution itself as well. The mean is this A1 hat, which I'll explain on the bottom left here. A1 hat it looks a lot like the update step for the denoising process. But instead of taking a step size of 1 on n, you take a step size of 1 minus tau. In plain English, this formula says there's 1 minus tau time left in the denoising if I continue moving with that flow velocity v for that amount of time. So I take a giant leap rather than like a small step. Here's my best guesstimate of what the clean sample would be. And that A1 hat, so it finds itself in the middle of this green blob distribution. And then the standard deviation of that green blob is r tau, which is mysterious right now, and we'll come back to it later. But I want you to take away from this one clear thing, which is we want to nudge the velocity. We want to somehow modify this velocity a little bit such that we increase our likelihood of recovering y. And to do that, like by doing that, we would actually move this green blob down and to the left a little bit so that this y, I haven't introduced y, but y is Y is this slice in the data space, which represents all variants of the next chunk that satisfy our condition, right? And so we want Y to be more central in this green blob to increase its likelihood. Okay, so this is the formula in RTC that shows you what the correction should look like. So if you look here, this is the original velocity that the model predicts. We want to modify that somehow a little bit. We want to nudge that so that it's the V pi GDM, which is aptly named. It's the velocity that is corrected in order to achieve this end. And the correction term is here. And let me unpack that. It's not so frightful as it looks on this slide. Okay, so first of all, we have this A1 hat sitting in the middle of that expression. Remember, there's 1 minus tau time left in the noisy. If I continue to move with flow velocity V for that amount of time, here's my best guesstimate of the clean sample. And so that's the middle of that green blob that I mentioned before. There's this now Y minus A1 hat, which is the error. It's like, remember I had this green blob here, and it's the distance between the middle of the green blob and the Y, so the error. And I've also put in this W here, which is the mask, because you only care about the error in the masked region, right? Because A is a full action chunk, but we only care about the beginning of the action chunk. And then this whole thing here is a vector Jacobian product. So you can get this by just doing backprop on the forward pass of a neural network, right? And I've drawn a little diagram here to remind you what this does. It gives you the direction of steepest descent for minimizing that error Y minus A1 hat, right? And so I've drawn that with a little blue arrow here. It doesn't necessarily point towards Y, but it's the direction of steepest descent in like on this contour landscape. So that's what this is. This is the direction of steepest descent. And then on the left here, you have the guidance weight, which is telling you how big of a step you should take in that direction of steepest descent, right? And the derivation, so you don't want to take too small of a step because then you're not going to satisfy your Y that you want. You don't want to take too large of a step because then you're going to ignore basically what the model's trying to do in the first place, potentially, which is model the data distribution, like if you index too hard on Y. So you want to do this step size in a very principled manner, and this is where a lot of the math in PyGDM tells us how to do that, right? And then finally, of course, neural networks aren't perfect. So you also, and that guidance weight, actually, when you plot it out, blows up to infinity near tau equals 0 and tau equals 1. So you want to cap that off so that you don't get instability. So you cap it off with a maximum weight beta. So yeah, for your mental model, the one key takeaway from all that is I want to take this green blob and I want to move it towards Y. Okay, so this is the formula RTC uses. They put that into code and they run it on their robot, and their robot runs smoothly. I tried it myself. So I cloned, I forked the OpenPy repository. They don't have that code on there, unfortunately, but they do have it on the robot now. But I coded it up at the time, tried it on the robot, and yeah, I was impressed. I wouldn't dare run my robot with the asynchronous inference naive approach, because then it would just probably break itself. But I ran it with this, and it looked pretty smooth. My only problem was that when I watched the rollouts, I could still see small jumps between transitions from chunk to chunk, and they were like on the order of 5 millimeters. So nothing that is really bad or would really hurt the policy, but I just got really curious and I wanted it to be super smooth, especially for demonstrations for people coming and visiting the office. And I also wondered maybe if it was smoother, it would very slightly increase the success rate. So one thing I noticed was that this guidance weight is of first order importance because it tells you the size of that step that you take in the direction of the vector Jacobian product. So I started playing around with it and found actually, if you dial it up a bit, you actually remove that little 5 millimeter jump between chunks. It becomes like butter smooth. You can't discern with your eyes that there's a jump. But I was afraid to just apply that in my code because that can cause robot instabilities if you don't do it in a principled manner. I wanted like one rule that would unify everything so I could understand what I can set in my code such that I can always be confident if I run a policy, it's going to be smooth and the robot's not going to go berserk. So that meant, okay, I have to dig into the theory, right? So what did I look at? Yeah, like I said, I was suspicious of this term first, especially this r tau squared, which was mysterious. And remember the green blob here. Remember how we said that actually it's a normal distribution with mean A1 hat and standard deviation r tau. Actually, it's also written down in the RTC paper that r tau's expression looks like this, right? And I wanted to figure out how was that derived. So there are many steps in the derivation, but I'm just going to point to the one most important one, which is when you apply this Bayes rule, right, to get the expression on the right-hand side here. And what you end up getting here, the rightmost term, is just a description of the forward noising process. So that's already by construction set to this standard, this normal distribution. So there's nothing you can do about that. But then there's this other term here, which is the prior data distribution. And in PyGDM derivation, that's set to the standard normal distribution. So standard deviation 1. There's not even a symbol for the standard deviation. But what I've done here is I've actually incorporated a symbol because this is what I was suspicious of. So I said, okay, what if I put a symbol there instead? Like I introduced this sigma d. This is the standard deviation of the prior distribution. And let's work through the math and rederive r tau, but now with this sigma d in mind. And then r tau ends up looking like this. So very similar to the one on the left here, but now it's got a sigma d in it. And very importantly is when you actually plot out the full guidance weight with that new r tau that I have over the domain of tau, and you try that for different sigma d, you see something interesting. So sigma d1, which is the PyGDM assumption, has this green curve here. Whereas sigma d just 0.5, so just half sigma d, has this orange curve. And if you pay attention, this left axis here is actually logarithmic. So this is an order of magnitude difference in the guidance weight. So I think we're onto something here, right? Like we have an assumption which we don't really understand the motivation for, and we have very, very high sensitivity of the outcome to that assumption. And by the way, I've motivated with math and plotting out why sigma d matters. I just want to also give you like one more way to look at it, like a different kind of intuition around it. Remember, we want to move this green blob such that the y is more centered on it. So I've drawn that as a kind of 1D plot instead, where I've drawn two possibilities for what the green blob's standard deviation could be. It could be 1, which is the blue one, or it could be narrower than 1, which is the yellow curve here, right? And a hat 1 is in the middle of those, y is off to the side, and we want to shift these to the right such that y is then covered better by that distribution, or y falls under the umbrella. And you can ask yourself the question, under which of these curves does y have a higher likelihood? And it is clearly the blue curve. And then you can ask yourself, which of these curves do I have to more aggressively push to the right in order to get y under the umbrella? And it's clearly the yellow curve. Right? So that's the other way to look at it. So now, okay, why would PyGDM just assume that sigma d, the standard deviation, is 1? Well, it makes perfect sense in the image domain, right? So in the image domain, you like going back to basics, to train these models, you normalize all of the data. And so by definition, its standard deviation is 1. But then you could say, okay, but what if I want to generate just an image of a cat? If I focus just on that subset of the data, is that standard deviation also 1? And I would argue, yes. Like, look at these pictures here. Like, they're all pictures of cats, but they look vastly different. Like, they have different background colors. The cats are in different positions. There are other things in the images. So I would argue then that probably still the standard deviation of these just cat images is 1. But I think this is what was lost in translation when we went from that world to the world of RTC. For robots, this is not true, right? So again, for the robot action data, we normalize that. And by definition, its standard deviation is 1. And I've drawn this yellow circle here, which is like, okay, if this gripper could move in any direction, what would be like the data distribution of its movement? But the thing is, again, just like we conditioned on a cat before, now we're conditioning on an observation and potentially a language command. So the language command might be pick up the blue block. There's clearly a blue block there. And every single human demonstrator would demonstrate moving that arm down towards the blue block, nothing else, right? So once you condition on that observation in the language potentially, you get this green ellipsoid here instead. And now sigma d being 1 is way too large. It's obvious that it's way too large, right? So that's my justification for making sigma d smaller. And after that, it's just experiments to determine what a good one is, right? Okay, and then the other thing I wanted to cover is this beta. So remember, this beta caps the guidance weight so that you don't have instability. If you plug this update step, if you plug the vPyGTM into the update step for standard denoising, you end up pulling a beta on n term out. Now in the RTC paper, they just say, okay, beta should be 5. And it so happens that their number of denoising steps is n is also 5. I think that the authors probably knew this, but I just wanted to clarify it because I didn't think it was written in the paper this way. Because there's this beta on n, I think it's safe to scale beta with n. So if you're doing 10 denoising steps, you can probably move beta from 5 to 10, right? And I'll show you the results for that too. Okay, so what does it look like when I apply these changes, a smaller sigma d and beta to cap that? Like, sorry, beta equals 10 for my number of denoising steps 10. So this is like a napkin folding demonstration. Well, I think we have about 6 or probably 8 hours of napkin folding data for this model here. So this model can continually fold napkins for an hour or more without needing intervention from humans. And it's really, really smooth. Like, any lack of smoothness you see is more about idiosyncrasies of the demonstrations, but there are no like little hops between chunks. Like, I can't spot them. I didn't show a comparison video because I don't think you would be able to spot 5mm jumps from the baseline either on this video. They are hard to spot, I'll admit that, but I think that this is just nicer. So, and then also, I mean, not necessarily related to the RTC result, but this is just a cool video of like it folding, 20, I think we did this for 45 minutes, then got bored, 25 napkins. And you can see like, it's really robust. And I think the smoothness helps with that robustness. It's even able to like correct itself when it picks up multiple napkins at a time or makes a mess. Let's see if we can get to that moment. Yeah, so here it's picked up multiple napkins, it puts one back, and it struggles to pick that corner, but then continues. So, okay, but those are all nice, like videos are nice. I just want to kind of put some numbers on this before we wrap up, right? So I did this experiment where I didn't actually have to roll out on the robot. So I have my data set, right? On the left here, all these blue chunks are the first chunk or one of the chunks in the data set. And the red chunks are chunks that I've then used RTC to generate, right? So we're going to pretend, like top left plot, have a look at that one, that we have like blue is a chunk of 50. And at the 25th step, we're going to pretend that in real life, that's when I start the next inference. So I generate this red chunk. And then at the 35th step, where this vertical gray line is, this gray dashed line is, that's when I switch chunks. And so naturally what you want is you want overlap to the left of the gray line, and you definitely want the chunks to be completely aligned along the gray line so that there's no jump between them. And this is with the baseline settings. So number of denoising steps 10, sigma d 1, and beta perhaps a bit unfairly 5. I could have also said that 10, but this will accentuate the differences. And you can see that there are gaps between the red and the blue line, especially along that vertical gray line where it's really problematic. But when you set sigma d to 0.2, and beta to 10, which is my settings, these overlaps are a lot better. They're almost perfect. And even in this plot here where they look imperfect, if you actually look at the scale, it's just because the scale is really narrow here. So I can go a step further because this is still quite like qualitative. And actually I can zoom in on these chunk transitions along this vertical gray line. And this little green arrow here, I can measure that for many, many points along many different trajectories and average it out and get a standard deviation. So again, here on the left is the baseline, and the average discrepancy was 4mm. So I said that I saw 5mm jumps. Here, the average discrepancy is 4mm up to 6mm. Does that make sense? And then on the very right here, where I've set my beta to 10 and my sigma d to 0.2, is actually an average discrepancy of just over 1mm. which makes a lot of sense because I can't see with my naked eye just looking at the robot the transitions between chunks. And that's the actual like numerical difference between these two hyperparameter settings. Another thing is I can sweep sigma d, because I've given you a principled idea of why sigma d shouldn't be 1, but not really what it should be. And actually, I didn't come up with a principled approach for that, but I just did some experimental sweeps, and I found that 0.2 was kind of a sweet spot. So again, I'm plotting average discrepancy. It looks like going further left to 0.2 is even better, but the thing is the instabilities start here, where like the robot starts jumping around a lot just because it goes unstable. So I decided to keep it safe and stay with sigma d 0.2. And then the other thing is, like I made this claim before, that you can safely scale beta with n. So these plots show 3 different like n's, like the number of denoising steps, 5, 10, and 20, and the optimal beta for each of those. And the optimal beta is usually just above n. And I found, okay, if you try to get greedy and squeeze more performance out of it by pushing beta up, again, you can get instabilities. Like the whole purpose of beta is to protect you against instabilities. But I found a good rule of thumb was that if you set beta equal to the number of denoising steps, you're pretty safe. Like I've been running my robot for months on these settings without ever having to change them, and it's always safe. And I can never see with my naked eye the transitions between chunks. Okay, so almost done. Just like I just wanted to highlight for me the main lesson learned here was that if you see a questionable assumption on a parameter x in some sort of derivation, and it's questionable to start with, and then also, very importantly, that the outcome is very sensitive to x, that's when you should be digging deeper. So that's my key takeaway from all of this investigation. And just some food for thought if you've been excited by the math here in the math in PyGDM. So the PyGDM framework is much more flexible than what's presented in RTC. So this mask W that I mentioned before, which was like 1s where the chunks overlap and 0s elsewhere, can more generally be what they call in PyGDM a corruption operator. And it can even be a nonlinear operator, right? And on top of that, you can even add stochasticity in. So what does that mean? It means that like we can consider other interesting corruption operators. And I'll give you just one example, but there are plenty more probably. So another one could be, instead of like trying to make the chunks match at the beginning, I could say, okay, I have a 50 hertz control loop, but I just want to give waypoints. So I want to make sure that the next chunk passes through these waypoints. So I can specify 1 or like 3 or 4 different waypoints over 1 second, and make sure that I use this PyGDM guidance to make sure that the chunk passes through those waypoints at least, and the model decides the rest. And another thing I can do is, because of this stochasticity that you can add in, you can add that in, and you can make your guidance less prescriptive. So you can make it less like, okay, I definitely want the beginning of the chunk to look like this, and you have no choice. And you can make it, I want it to look roughly like this. And model, I'll let you decide. I'll give you some autonomy in deciding how close you make it to this. So that can also be interesting, especially when considering it in combination with other interesting corruption operators. But yeah, that's that. I mean, does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, Alex, thanks so much for presenting. This was super insightful, and I think giving the full background was, leading all the way to where you made your contribution, I think is super, super helpful. So thanks everyone for attending. And yeah, floor is open for questions. I saw someone just raise their hand and put it back down, but yeah, Prabeen. Prabeen, you can go ahead. All right. While he figures out his mic issue, I have a quick question. So, so you, Sigma D, you have sort of found 0.2 to work fairly well. Is there any sort of, have you noticed, at least maybe even just qualitatively, have you noticed any kind of, yeah, I think this is the point I want to look at. Have you noticed any sort of degradation in any specific types of movements or tasks when you decrease that decrease that standard deviation, and then I think the other question I have too is on the left side here. Maybe even just repeating yourself a little more of like why for natural images standard deviation of 1 makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. So have I noticed any degradation? I mean, I have. If I reduce sigma d below 0.1, I see degradation, but I don't have like it happens in these situations, because normally when you see that degradation, it's like your finger's on the e-stop button and you're worried that your robot's going to hurt itself. So as soon as you see that, you just back off and don't do it anymore unless you really want to know the answer. But what I have found is just setting these settings 0.2 for sigma d and 10 for beta with num steps 10 is I just don't have to touch anything. I have not thought about it even once ever since I put this in the code months ago. Like it's like a default parameter. So it's pretty cool that it just works so cleanly everywhere. And I never see the hops either between chunks. Yeah, I mean, for me, this one is one of those that I'm not really able to get out in really clean words, but for some reason it's obvious in my mind. It just happens to be like the question about why natural images sigma d is 1. So just remember, the starting point is always going to be, you take your whole data domain and you normalize it. So by definition, for both of these scenarios, sigma d is just 1. It's when you add in the conditioning that you need to ask yourself the question, is sigma d still 1 for that slice of the data domain, right? And I think the explanation of why that's not true for the robot is pretty clear from this image here. And for me, for this image here, is just like, I think I would have to actually just write a script and actually like plot out the standard deviations for just cats versus all natural images. So you would take ImageNet and you'd plot out the standard deviation, and actually you wouldn't even bother because you actually computed the standard deviation and normalized them. So the standard deviation is going to be 1. But then you take all the cats in ImageNet and then you'd compute the standard deviation for those. And what I believe, I should have probably done this, is that you'd find that it's pretty close to the one for natural images. Just because, you can have all sorts of, like, what are the variations in an image? They're like the pixels, right? And so you can have cats that are completely different colors. Like, just because I said cat, it doesn't say anything special about the color of the image. It doesn't even say where the contours are on the image, like, because the cat can move left, can move right? And it doesn't, and on top of that, you can have other things inside the image. So here's a cat and a human. So that's why I'm saying, like, the degree of variation that you're going to see in cat images is about the degree of variation you're going to see in all natural images if you don't just consider semantics, right? If you just consider pixels, like, at a very fine level.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I hope that helps. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Hello.
Robin.
Oh, hi. Hi, Alexander. Thank you for the tutorial. This has been very helpful. I have a quick question. So there are other ways to condition your inference and diffusion models. One of the most popular ways in painting, where you basically, like in the denoising step, you basically have some particular pixels in the image which are fixed, and you try to have them fixed throughout the denoising steps, while the model figures out how to fill the remaining of the image. So that has been one of the classical ways to condition your inference of a pre-trained diffusion model in the images. So does that also apply to like the way we try to condition previous chunk with the current chunk? Like, have you tried something like that?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, this is the in-painting that they present in the, I think, the 2015 Sol Bigstein paper, which is like kind of the paper on diffusion models, like the original one. And by the way, I'll say, like you said, that's called in-painting. This is also called in-painting. So they call this in-painting in PyGDM. But the in-painting method that you mentioned there, I did try that in the code, and I did not get good results. And I did not investigate why. So the answer is, I've tried it. It didn't work as well. I don't exactly know why. And I guess in the spirit of, like, kind of spirit I've been presenting in this talk is, like, it's about the discovery process. Instead of giving you an answer, I'll just say, like, to me, that's really just interesting and something that if I had the time or interest, like more interest in, I'd look into for sure. Like I'd then do more experiments and compare the two approaches, and then dig into the theory the same way I have here and try to understand why this approach worked better than that approach. Like I did see the proof in the Soldigstein paper. It seems quite principled. This approach seems really principled from like a Bayesian perspective. So I don't know just off the bat, like why one should work better than the other.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Even about some of the earlier parts, like if you're new to machine learning for robotics.
I guess one question I had in the beginning, very beginning of the slide, and I have this in general is I think you had a slide on what are the possible actions. So like, does it vary based on like different VLAs or like?
Was it this slide here?
No, in the very beginning, you had like that diagram that is like before this. Go back. Yeah, this one. Yeah, so like for example, you mentioned okay, joint angles or end effectors are action, but like does it vary like between VLAs, let's say?
Yeah, I think some VLAs do end effector pose, some do joint angles. Like end effector pose is usually a good one when you want to be able to do cross embodiment, because you know the morphologies of different robots are going to be different. So the joint, what a certain set of joint angles means for one robot actually means something materially different for another robot. But if you just talk about end effector pose, that unifies those two different robots, because that's mostly what you care about, where the end effector is. So that's one thing you can do, but there are weaknesses to that as well. So once you specify an end effector pose that you want your robot to go to, you have to do inverse kinematics, and that pose might not be kinematically feasible. So when you say, does it depend on the VLA? Well, yeah, it depends on when the person sat down and wrote the VLA, what they decided the form of the output space and data labeling was going to be, and what they were going to regress to. But actually, like works like physical intelligence have shown that there is a lot of knowledge transfer in the VLM part of the VLA that is useful even when you're working in joint angles, and those joint angles mean different things for those different embodiments in terms of what the actual outcome is. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks.
Anybody else?
Hey,
Yes,
Alex, I would like to ask about the optimization view. Like if we look at from the view of the intuition around why a narrower prior distribution results in a stronger guidance. So so here you described about the y minus a hat term that points in the direction of the steepest descent of the loss function. So then you had kind of discussed about this guy here, the error and the Jacobian term here. So like I get that here when the prior is narrow, the score kind of dominates the denoising update. So kind of increasing the guidance weight is equivalent to increasing the relative step size along the continuity gradient. So so I was wondering, like does your intuition here also comes into fruition that narrow prior is kind of equivalent to confident but brittle policies?
Could you say the last part again, please?
So like how does this intuition kind of like you say that your narrow prior is kind of equivalent to confident but brittle? Yeah. So I was wondering from the previous papers that I have read here. So the policy is kind of brittle. So it I think so. It will break easily. So it will have some kind of uncertainty or overconfidence in like in the local trajectories that it refers to. I may be wrong here, but like
Yeah. I mean, I think you're saying. I think you're worried that by trying to increase the guidance weight, I'm imposing overconfidence on this desired Y.
Yes.
So, and then there was another slide that I had before, which I didn't include, which was the step just prior to showing you VPyGDM, right?
Okay.
Where I showed you, so there was a point where I showed you this complicated looking VPyGDM expression, which was the original velocity and this correction term. And I just said, hey, like PyGDM derives this in a principled manner, right? And part of that, and the slide I got rid of, was working in terms of score functions, right? So in PyGDM, they start with the original score function, right? And they say, okay, we want to modify this score function to account for the desired Y. So you put a conditioned upon Y inside it. That's all you do to change it so that you incorporate your Y. And then you apply Bayes' rule. And by applying Bayes' rule, you actually get back your original score function and this new term here, which actually this ends up becoming that correction, that big complicated looking correction term here. So what I'm getting at is that this is done in a principled way, and it's done in a way that like balances in a Bayesian way, right? Balances the desire to recover your data distribution and the desire to get Y, and it balances that optimally, right? So, and then when I say, okay, they have this they made this assumption about the prior, and I say, actually, no, that assumption was incorrect, and sigma d is meant to be smaller. That doesn't step outside of the PyGDM framework. It just corrects their assumptions. So so as long as my assumption is a bit better than theirs, I have not strayed away. I have not kind of negated any of the Bayesian optimality here, right? As long as my assumption is better than theirs. So then the argument is that actually, because my assumption is better than theirs, it's more balanced in the Bayesian sense. It's more stable and less brittle.
Kind of. I didn't notice the prior here. So like you were kind of it's like you are kind of, your policy is adhering to that. So yeah, it's kind of it becomes, I think so, more stable as you perform as it moves closer to that the Gaussian plot that you have in your blog too. Yeah,
exactly. So, and when I started doing this, I came up with all sorts of other theories about why my technique was working, but none of them I liked because I had that same concern that you had. It's like, no, I'm fudging this. I'm just changing this because I feel like it. So I had to dig down and find the source of the problem and make sure that whatever I changed, it didn't actually change like the fundamental math, right? And then I didn't feel like I was fudging things, right?
Cool.
This is a good question. I like it.
We are at time. If there are any more questions, feel free to reach out to Alex. I believe his LinkedIn and everything is all in the bio for the meeting invite here. So yeah, if there are any more questions, if Alex, you want to stick around, you can take them. Otherwise, reach out to Alex. I'm going to stop the recording now as well.
Yeah.